Welcome to our inaugural second of two Echo Thursday National Shared Mobility Summit book clubs. This week, we'll be discussing the Routledge Handbook of Public Transport with contributor Matt Daus. So I will quickly introduce Matt and then hand it over to him for a quick discussion of his chapter presentation, after which we will open it up for questions either about the chapter or if anything else that you might have regarding the subject. So to introduce our speaker today, Matthew W. Daus, Esquire currently serves as Transportation Technology Chair at the City University of New York's, or CUNY's, Transportation Research Center at the City College of New York, where he conducts research and continues to be extensively published as an expert on ground transportation regulation and technology. As a CUNY, distinguished lecturer from 2010 to 2018, he taught courses on transportation history, policy, sustainability, for-hire regulation, and technology. Mr. Daus also continues to serve since 2009 as president of the International Association of Transportation Regulators, or IATR, a nonprofit educational peer group of government transportation regulators from around the world, promoting best regulatory and innovative practices. Mr. Daus is the longest serving commissioner, chair, and CEO of the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission, the TLC, where he served from 2001 to 2010. Prior to his tenure as commissioner, Mr. Daus served in many other executive and council positions in NYC government for almost 20 years, including general counsel to the TLC and the NYC Community Development Agency, special counsel to the TLC and NYC Trade Waste Commission, NYC Human Rights Prosecutor, and commissioner of the NYC Civil Service Commission. Mr. Daus is a partner at Windels Marx, Lane & Mittendorf, LLP, where he founded and chairs the Transportation Practice Group since 2010. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Daus. I will hand it over to him.
Thank you for that introduction, Rudy, and thanks for doing this book club. It's an interesting experiment. I hope we live up to the standards of SumC and making this an interesting dialogue between all of us. Rudy has a background in publishing, which got him really excited about this particular session and got me excited about it too. It's the first time I think I'm doing a book talk for anything that I've written. And I just want to also congratulate SumC and Benji for all of the wonderful work that they're doing. When I come to a SumC conference, I often tell people, and I run my own conferences with the IATR, and we think we do a good job, but SumC really has the future nailed down. Of all the conferences I go to, it's the present, the future, all the stakeholders that are going to be involved in anything that's innovative are there. And we miss seeing everybody in person, but we've also followed their lead in doing virtual conferences the way they've been doing it. So it's a great group. Sharon really built this organization up, and I can't think of a better person than Benji to take over. Someone who's got vision and a great team behind him. So I want to congratulate SumC on a great conference so far. I've been attending many sessions, and we're also at my firm proud sponsors of the conference as well for several years now, including this year. So I'm going to get right to it. I think I'm allowed to share my screen here. Yep, here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about not just my chapter, but also this book, which was a tremendous amount of work that went into it. Let me just try to get to, there we go, full screen mode. Okay, great. All right. So the name of this this book, which is it's a comprehensive volume, it's called the Routledge Handbook of Public Transport, and you know, it recently came out this year. We've been working on it for 2 to 3 years. We have some excellent editors who've done a great job. I think we already went over my bio, but here's the book, and there's a 20% discount if you use this promo code. My chapter, thanks to the publisher, was made available for free to everybody who's attending today. So you should have that in your email announcing it. But it's an international group of experts. I mean, the editors are from Sydney, Australia. They put together many chapters from 63 authors and broke the book up into several parts, which makes sense for people who are part of the SumC community. There's a multimodal approach to the content in the book. It views public transport in the context of you know, innovation, all modes, including air and sea as well. And it provides an in-depth evidence-based examination of the current issues, but it addresses the future and also the research needs facing public transport. And just briefly to go over the book, and I want to congratulate Corinne Mully and John Nelson, you know, and Steve Ison, who really were the driving force as editors behind this book. It's broken up into 6 sections. So the first section of the book, or the textbook, covers frameworks, mobility as a service, integration, intermodal connections. The section of the book where my taxi chapter is located covers various modes in the modal settings section. You know, bus, rail, air, ferry, paratransit, a potpourri of topics on that one. Section 3 is public transport and the environment. The health impacts, the first and last mile connections, big data for planning. You know, a lot of these issues are issues that SumC has covered in the past at its conferences. Section 4, specific public transport delivery issues, social inclusion, parking, dog, service animal travel, accessibility and design for all. Section 5 is all about smart cards, data for public transport planning, platform crowding, railway station wait times, planning, passenger travel patterns, bus frequency. And last but not least, Section 6 talks about the future, automated vehicles, governance of smart mobility, all the issues that we're going to try to touch a little bit on today when it comes to the taxi mode. So my chapter, okay, was known as Taxis. And as the taxi commissioner for so many years and being involved with this industry, you know, literally for 20 years now, I have my own viewpoint, but I assume that the reader knows nothing about the taxi industry and its history. And we try to cover as much as we can, but it's mostly about the US, but it does draw some comparative conclusions and evidence from other jurisdictions around the world. It also includes the impacts of COVID. You know, midway through, you know, this process when COVID hit, we updated our chapters to, you know, make the book fresh. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, basically an overview of what is in this chapter, if you have a chance to read it. But I'm going to go a little bit beyond the chapter. Talk about, you know, what happened with the taxi industry, what went right and wrong, what did history teach us over time, and how can we not repeat the mistakes of the past, hopefully this time around, as we enter a new era post-COVID, and see if the taxi industry can be saved, or should it be saved? I mean, these are issues that are being asked by many. I'm a big fan of the industry, but there's obviously a lot of challenges and issues that they had. And we're going to try to cover some of that ground too. But in terms of the chapter, we go back to the Great Depression of the 30s and how regulators started even regulating in this arena. And, you know, there was an oversupply following the Great Depression of taxis in New York and other cities. And there are actually taxi riots that occurred when, lo and behold, there was not enough business for the taxi drivers, and they demanded that there be some type of change. And Alderman Haas, which was a local city council member in the 1930s, put what is in place now, and still to this day, a cap on the number of taxis. And many, many cities followed that lead. Boston, Miami, Chicago, San Fran, and Philly all have medallion systems with caps. And for those cities who don't, there's usually a control on supply and demand. The demand side being controlled also by rate regulation. The taxis are different from other types of for-hire services like limousines or TNCs, and that the government sets the rate of fare in almost every city. Regulation is local, okay, as opposed to statewide or provincial, and the fares are local. Some cities have different economies and a different ability for people to pay what the market can tolerate. But the supply has always been controlled in most of these cities, and the process could be one where consultants do a study and then you could apply for a permit. Sometimes the onus is on the taxi fleet to go to the regulator and say, I need more vehicles because demand is high and we need to increase the supply. So the history of the taxi industry goes hand in hand with supply and demand. And that all came out of really some of the issues that were faced when we had a failure of the system in the Great Depression. So it covers some of that turf. It talks about different models that are out there in the taxi world, franchises, certificates, permits, and the medallions, which are actual property interests that could be bought and sold, and which unfortunately tanked. Then we cover, of course, the history of the disruption movement. I left the government before all this started. The medallions were worth half of what they peaked at when I left government, about 500 grand. They went up exorbitantly in New York City. And it took a while for the disruption actually to hit home and really cause damage to the taxi industry all across the country. And there are different experiences in different countries, which we touch on. We don't go too in depth into this in the chapter, but it touches upon how things were a little bit late in Canada. We all know what kind of happened in the United States. We had Colorado. Let me just back up. In San Francisco, where all of this started, Uber first started as a cab entity, went across the street when they figured out that they couldn't get their way with the SFMTA, and the SFMTA declined to regulate them. And what ended up happening is the California PUC, after Colorado's PUC, Public Utilities Commission, had a hearing and rulemaking, literally right after Colorado started its process, California picked it up and passed what's known as the Transportation Network Company laws, carving out a special category for insurance and background checks and licensure on a state level. And those laws are passed in pretty much almost every state in the US. The taxi ridership in New York City declined by 51%, and then at the end of 2019 it went down significantly. The ridership and the driver earnings were holding strong for several years, because when I left the industry was in really, really good shape. Probably the golden years, the best they've ever been, in terms of ridership, tourism in New York City and even in other cities. And it took a while for it to hit, but ultimately, the ridership declines and the growth of Uber and Lyft caught up with the taxi industry. It just, over a period of years, it caused first the ridership to drop, earnings to drop, and then, of course, the medallion values follow. In Canada and Europe and Asia, there are different approaches. It's not one size fits all. Europe had incredible resistance from the regulatory standpoint to the likes of Uber and Lyft. And Canada kind of followed to some degree what the US did, allowing them to operate. The regulators tried to shut them down in the early days. They went over their heads of the administrative agencies to the politicians and to the elected officials and the legislatures at the state level to basically create this licensing category really for them. The taxis were banned, as well as limousines, from participating in that business model, if you look at the language of many of these laws that were passed. So this created what we would call an uneven playing field, between the taxis and the TNCs, and it really was the beginning of the decline in the US, and in many other countries it did as well, but not as probably severe and as dramatic as the US. Europe made it difficult, and Asia did as well, depending on which country you're in, or United Arab Emirates. There were different approaches. They all let the TNCs in, and the TNCs even came in Singapore on the taxi side, with Grab and Ola working with taxis. So there's a lot of different business models out there, but for the most part, the taxi industry has been really decimated in the United States most of all. And as a case study, it's a simple matter of supply and demand. This chart shows from 2015 until the 2018, just a snapshot of the decline of those two lines going down are medallion values. The line that's going up is the number of vehicles that were put on the street until we have now a cap following various suicides and unfortunate situations that occurred in New York that prompted the city council to finally put a cap on limousines. Limousines or liveries or black cars, they never have been regulated with supply and demand. The market kind of controlled what type of vehicles needed to be put on the road and how many. But the TNCs were operating like taxi cabs, a hybrid using a meter inside of an app. And that created a scenario in New York and other cities where they needed to get their response time shortened so that passengers would use them more than the taxis. And it was also a different experience than a taxi. These were nicer vehicles when they first started out. You could say some of them were almost borderline luxury. Now, those things have changed over the years as different classes of vehicles are available on the TNC apps. But during that period of time, they really grew. When Mayor de Blasio tried to cap them, they doubled down, and you could see the exponential growth during this time frame and how that really was the beginning of the huge decline in the medallion values and the taxi industry in New York City and in all the other cities I mentioned. Pretty much happened across the board. But New York City was the only city to put a minimum or living wage in place for the high volume app services. Only place to put a cap in place at this point. Seattle has done something as well on minimum wage guarantees, but no one's put the cap in place for competitors to taxi. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over time. After the pandemic, those numbers of competing for hire vehicles, which are typically prearranged, anything from a community car service to a black car, they've all been capped, not just the high volume apps of Uber, Lyft, and Via vehicles that are on the road. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. And of course, things got worse when COVID hit. The ridership declined by 94% in New York, 63% in Chicago, 97% in Las Vegas, and it was really, really adding insult to injury, unfortunately. Just as the industry was starting to stabilize, even at a lower level of operation, it just really decimated the industry. Now, I'll tell you what's interesting now is I've done some internal studies that show that taxis are actually cheaper for the first time than Ubers and Lyfts in New York City in particular. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that there's enhanced unemployment where a lot of drivers are just not working and won't come back until Labor Day. So I think, when you look at the algorithms, and I don't fully, and nobody really fully understands them, but when there are less Uber and Lyft vehicles on the road, the prices tend to go up. And they've been actually servicing, according to my data, the outer boroughs of New York City, outside of Manhattan's core, more than ever before. A lot of different reasons for that. Probably people working from home and they're getting around locally. So taxis are actually hot now. It's like, it's the new thing, believe it or not. But how long is that going to last? It's anybody's guess. There's a lot of problems in the industry, and we're going to try to go over some of those soon. During the pandemic, also, some interesting things happened, like the city of New York and other cities, and like Washington, D.C., allowing for food delivery or subsidies for meals to be delivered to seniors, like Meals on Wheels programs. Package delivery started. There's a company that signed contracts with various taxi fleets around the country that is taking advantage of using the downtime for taxis and limos and black cars. So when you're not picking up a passenger and you have nothing else to do, they're doing package delivery now that everybody wants packages being delivered to compete with Amazon and others. So there's some interesting stuff going on that happened during the pandemic, and how long it stays and how it grows, it remains to be seen. The next part of the chapter talks about the socioeconomic impacts of disruption. While TMCs made for quicker transport, and many love the services. It did, from a policy standpoint, for transportation issues, create some new problems or not solve some problems. If you talk to Uber and Lyft, they will say that they serve underserved communities. I think there's a difference of opinion on that, depending on who you talk to. Traffic congestion in the environment. I was saying from day one, it's only a matter of time before the state and local DOTs and the government has a backlash against the company's exponential growth. And that happened in New York, and it could happen elsewhere. Wheelchair accessibility and equity really took a hit. There was resistance to putting wheelchair vehicles on the road. And some negotiations under the TNC laws, like Seattle, there was money that was set aside by the TNCs to actually have the taxis provide the service. It was an interesting development. Taxis ended up getting pushed into providing wave service. There was resistance there, but now it's been embraced. In fact, in some cities, I just did a study working with Los Angeles' Department of Transportation, an engagement looking at the taxi franchise system there. And one of the things that I learned from the stakeholders right up front was that there's no business left for taxis in LA except for airport and wheelchair accessible NEMT service. There's nobody who is hailing cabs outside of New York. It just doesn't happen that frequently anymore because people just call Ubers and Lyfts and Vias. So, it'll be interesting to see how this develops, but this has been something that the TNCs have been criticized for, not having a program in place there. And also there's obviously the gig economy issue that, AB5 in California and Prop 22, and whether these drivers that are driving for Uber and Lyft should be employees or independent contractors. And what's the untold story that nobody focuses on when we talk about the gig economy and AB5 is that AB5 still applies to taxis and limousines in California. Prop 22 creates a new model for benefits and labor and wages for only TNCs, not for taxis. So it's a big question mark what happens to the labor model if more states start adopting the AB5 type of approach and start treating drivers as employees. Let's take a few moments to talk about why the taxi industry failed. We don't go into too much of this in the book, but I think it's important to point out for context. There's a couple of reasons that I just jotted down here on the page. Number one, local regulation. If you spoke to the taxi industry and the national groups many years ago, there was always a push on DC to try to convince the Congress members that you should leave taxis alone. They're locally regulated. Congress should have nothing to do with them. FMCSA deals with buses and stretch limos, but for taxis, we're locally regulated, and they wanted that carve out, that local control. It ended up being something that kind of tied their hands in many ways when the TNCs and the disruption came along. Companies didn't cooperate with each other. Okay, the limousine industry cooperates with each other. The big companies, when you have to travel, somewhere to a foreign country or a different state, they don't have offices in every city, but they have affiliation agreements where they split the fares and allow another company to pick you up as if it's the same company. So my account with XYZ limo, let's say in New York City, there'll be ABC limo picking me up when I land in London, and it'll be charged to my XYZ account in New York City. It's seamless. They work together well. Big and small companies. The taxi industry did not work together well historically. These are mostly family-owned companies, generational businesses, where sometimes the parents put the kids in the position of coming into the company, but don't take the strings away and let them fly on their own. This is the way I always did it. Why do we need to innovate? There's this whole things were always working so well scenario going on for so long. They had it so good that it took a while for them to realize that they had to do something. I'll never forget, there was someone who will remain nameless, a San Francisco taxi owner, who at a conference made a comment that Lyft is a local problem in San Francisco that will go away and will be dealt with when the pink mustaches started appearing. Everyone, including myself, was wrong at the early stages of this movement. The millennial generation really wanted this. Smartphone apps were hot. Everything was being done on a smartphone app for the first time. Private equity investment really was what allowed Uber and Lyft to succeed in their disruption. Without that $200–300 million, it never would have happened. I'm sorry. When you create new laws and do all these things, you need to be well financed. They subsidized rides, they subsidized drivers for so long. There was really no other way for it to happen. But there really was, to their point, no other way to innovate. But the taxi industry was slow at the they were slow at the trigger. The local companies are like the Hatfields and the McCoys. The famous story of the warring neighbors. What would it have taken for the companies in these cities to work together and develop an app with the 4 or 5 companies that are there on their own, so that if a cab can't pick you up in a half hour, there'll be somebody close by, even their competitor, that would share the business. The way the limousine industry operates, they didn't do that. They also, the messaging wasn't resonating. Their brand strategy defense was flawed. At some point, when TNCs decided they were not working with taxis at all, they wanted to bash the brand and decimate it. Ashton Kutcher coming out saying that they're the mafia and that they were a cartel. The lingo that was spun with all the free press that the TNCs got, the comeback that the taxi industry has, well, we have background checks that are better. That was it. It resonated with some people, like Pamela Anderson from Baywatch, who went to the bat of the limo industry. But the celebrities mostly came out, and many of them were really supporting the new cool thing on the block, which was the TNCs. So they really didn't have an effective strategy to stop the brand damage that was going on. The conventions had multiple apps there that were competing, and part of the problem is when a new app came along, a local taxi fleet would basically tell the company, I'll do your app, I'll try it out, but I want an exclusive with you. So it prevented these companies from getting everybody on the same platform. So that was really some of the problems that happened. And then, when Uber and Lyft and others went to the state legislature to create new laws just for themselves, that created an already disjointed governance structure with local regulation, made it worse, right? So now you have these 2 sets of laws, and local regulation kind of ties the hands of the taxi industry. They're still stuck with, the same getting approval for their fares from the regulator. They're still stuck with inspections and all these additional regulatory requirements which don't apply to TNCs. So these are some of the issues that percolated, and they were once again too slow to come up with a solution, because the conventions had different booths with different sponsors with different apps. It took the industry a good 7 years, I think, to do a competition where they picked one app to be like the app of the industry, and it ended up not working because it was too late. The industry was already destroyed by that time. If they would have acted quickly, maybe in San Francisco, and came up with one app for all the taxi industry, and maybe made some service changes to how they operate, they may have been able to not stop Uber and Lyft, but they may have been able to survive and thrive better than they are now. There's no question about that in my mind. And some of the issues that will govern the future of the industry are accessible service and state and local government. We're going to talk about most of these things now and very briefly. But here's the laundry list. And I'm going to start with talking about the things that the taxi industry didn't do, that they could have done if they were being innovative or trying to get ahead of this issue, in addition to the things that I mentioned already, which is to obviously make your service better, make the cars nicer, invest in it, and get an app or a better way to get your taxis delivered to people more quickly. Aside from that, this, to the taxi industry's credit, they tried very, very hard to convince the federal government to let them partake in this $800 million contract that was designed exclusively for multi-state TNCs. The way the bid was written, the taxi industry couldn't even be considered for the service of the federal government and the GSA, basically telling all the federal employees that we're not going to buy cars anymore for the federal government. We're going to let Uber and Lyft transport our federal employees around when they're doing work around the country. The taxi industry tried, but unfortunately they lost. They didn't get any part of this contract, and It probably will be a good thing for the government, to reduce the carbon footprint and potentially save money in the long haul. But really, why were they left at the curb? We all know it. Some see the Mobility on Demand project, the FTA, and all of the great work that's been done with the pilot programs. But where are taxis when it comes to first and last mile? I mean, when it was first announced at the TRB, I remember going to that first session. Uber and Lyft and Via, their staff were all over this thing. Before it was even implemented, they were talking about it with the officials. Taxis were missing in action. If they would have been more proactive with dealing with the FTA, they could have gotten some of these pilot programs for first and last mile, like exist in LA County and Dallas. DART does it with, and these things are the future, really. The first and last mile public transit partnerships where you get off the bus, you get off the train, and the last mile is a TNC. Why didn't taxis participate in that? Why weren't they selected? Mobility as a service. I was blown away when Pittsburgh launched Move PGH, saying it's the first true mobility as a service system in the US. Now, we know that the Sandbox program has multiple experiments in this regard. We know that Europe is doing this. We know everyone's talking about it, and it is the future. But I was blown away when I saw that taxis and TNCs were actually not part of the mobility as a service program that was launched. How? Why? Has a lot to do with, I think, with the mindset of public transit. I mean, private taxis were always considered in a separate silo for regulation purposes, and public transit dealt with buses and rail, and it took years for some of these public transit agencies to even deal with TNCs and some of the innovative things that they're doing now. Finally, they're there, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the government kind of treats taxis like it's a utility, but there's a separate agency that does it usually, and it's not part of the transportation planning. So that governance issue is there, and it's always looming in the background as to why things ended up the way they are. And unfortunately, for the future, if it doesn't change, if we don't have a land transport authority like Singapore, or a TfL like London, or an SFMTA, which is probably the closest thing we have to a multimodal governance agency, but it doesn't include TNCs. Until we get there, taxis are kind of out on their own, and they always have been. Not to say that they can't be more proactive, but they kind of got stuck with all these regulations in a regulatory cocoon, and it's been hard to break out of it. And this is the problem that they have now. But yes, they're missing in action on mobility as a service. Some missed opportunities. When some mayors and governors started feeling guilty that they went too far with TNCs and they handed over the keys to the kingdom to them, they started talking about leveling the playing field. And regulators at our conferences at IATR, we were having many discussions on how do we do that? Do we waive licensing fees? Do we do all these Band-Aid things, giving them preference at taxi stands and at the airports? Or do we really go in for the kill and put a universal app that the government controls? I did a study for Montreal at the time when all these different cities were talking about doing it. Chicago ultimately did it, but picked two apps. San Francisco came very close to putting a system in place where they would have had a platform with a city app with everyone plugged into it. Every single, and of course the industry fought it. A lot of different reasons why they resisted it. A lot of it had to do with every local taxi company probably had their favorite app that they wanted to win this thing, and they picked a Nevada company to run it, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. But if it would have worked, it would have been a game changer. Another failed experiment was a company called Carhu, which was like the Expedia for the black car and taxi industry. They were putting all the different companies onto one app, everybody but Uber and Lyft. But basically, you could get the closest and the cheapest cab aggregated, and you could click on it, and multiple companies, and they would come to you. For a variety of different reasons, they got a lot of traction, and then they fizzled and ran out of money. And actually launched in London and were ready to launch in LA and New York. But these are ideas that would have been game changers if they were implemented. And many of the discussions fizzled, unfortunately. One thing this is still, actually, it's not Shark Week anymore. Shark Week is 6 weeks. So we're still within Shark Week. But, you know, the sharks are circling, right? You know, the threat of automation to the taxi industry is there. And taxis have not really partnered with anybody in the US. You know, they, unlike Lyft and Uber and Via, who have partnered with and been working with auto manufacturers or trying to do it themselves, they're embracing the movement. The taxi industry has not. And you know, that probably needs to change, but they're kind of on an island being circled right now, you know, and could be facing elimination unless they figure out a way to survive. Now, let's talk about some things that they did right, okay, for the future. Public paratransit, San Francisco, Kansas City, New York, a model that I worked on before I left the taxi commission many years ago, which I think is a shining success, which has saved tens of millions of dollars for the MTA, using point-to-point taxis, especially wheelchair accessible vehicles, and even black cars and TNCs, to take people who are part of the Accessoride program to and from where they need to go, as opposed to multi-passenger vans, which have been inefficient and based on a federal study I did, federally funded study, where about many years ago, about $60 per trip with 1.5 passengers versus $15 to $20 now for a cab trip. So the savings is dramatic. You know, you can save 2/3 of the price. And the Sandbox even has some pilots that are showing how taxis can be an integral part of the future for accessible transport. And there's an interesting entity known as Nemtech. And what's really interesting to me is I never thought taxis could disrupt anything, but because they were responsible for all these years as a result of TNCs and regulators forcing them to get involved with wheelchair accessible vehicle transport, they now have the inventory that everybody needs on the private side. You know, the Medicaid, Medicare subsidized, you know, transported passengers to and from dialysis centers, from senior centers, hospitals, medical transport that's on the private side. The taxis are disrupting that industry now with the brokerage models that exist there with the different types of vehicles. And there is a scenario where wheelchair accessible vehicles may have to work with Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft are coming into that space now, big time. And they want to take the contracts away from the brokers of the world and run that industry with Uber Health and some of these other different platforms that are out there. And you know what? They don't have the vehicles, so who are they going to use? So there is a scenario where taxis, wheelchair taxis could end up working for Uber and Lyft. But this is an area where they actually have done something good. And this has been sustaining the taxi industry, frankly, along with the airport trips, like I said. Now, EVs, there's not a lot that's been done so far. When I was working for the government with Mayor Bloomberg, you know, we mandated hybrid electric cabs. Every city was following us after that. And then we lost because under the Clean Air Act and EPCA, you can't really mandate hybrid electrics. We went up to the US Supreme Court, we lost it badly, but we had incentives that New York City and many cities put into place, and many of the fleets turned over to hybrid electric. Now, there was a point in time where people may have thought that there could be a different alternative fuels. I think pretty much the technology is settled in on maybe hydrogen fuel cell, but mostly electrification. The infrastructure, unfortunately, isn't there. But I haven't seen, unfortunately, a lot of innovation in the US yet, but there's a company called Gravity that is launching in New York City, which is looking to redesign and rebrand the cab, something which it really desperately needs, and have an all-electric fleet. It's gotten a lot of attention. I think putting these Tesla Model Ys on the street in New York City and in other cities eventually is really a potential game changer in terms of working with regulators and helping the environment and rebranding the taxi industry. So I'll end with this because I know Rudy and others probably have a lot of questions, but how do we make sure that history doesn't repeat itself? Here's some advice for the taxi industry, you know, which I think they can do. They need to reimagine themselves. Flywheel came as close as they possibly could in San Francisco to doing that, you know, painting the cars red, having an app, but they really need to get on one app. They need to get their act together, and whether they're aggregating with each other or they're looking to innovate, and they need to do it on their own because the government hasn't done that yet. And then they might be able to integrate as part of a MOS system eventually. They need to embrace automated vehicles. Okay, they're coming whether they like it or not. So look, taxis have a property interest and a right to be on the road. What better place for the automated vehicle companies to go, right? When cities are looking like New York and elsewhere to limit the number of cars on the road, they're actually sitting in a place where they could actually get their drivers to test these vehicles and ultimately have a retirement plan where the automated vehicle companies could pay their salaries until retirement, take the permits, and then the taxis become the automated vehicles on the street. It's an opportunity that regulators and the industry will have to embrace, including the unions that seem to be completely opposed to it. EVs we spoke about, NEMT and public power transit, more can be done there. Cash-strapped public transit agencies post-COVID, even with the influx of cash, need to fix the inefficient public power transit system. If taxis and software platforms that they develop are able to rest in between the government and the private industry, they could be competitors when we go out to bid for a mobility as a service app in various cities, because they're already working on the public power transit side. The brokerage apps, okay, are the precursor where all of these different vehicles help deliver public power transit under one platform and one app. That's the future. If we can figure out a way to do that and start there, the taxi industry could actually be well positioned to be part of the automation solution and the mobility as a service solution, because ultimately government's going to end up doing that. And if you're a vendor for government that has an app that works on the Access-a-Ride system, you're in a very, very good spot. Look, the taxi industry lost the battle at the federal level to get to replace employee vehicles owned by the government. But what about the state and local level? You know, the local connections that taxi companies have with the mayors and the legislators going back decades, why not convince them to put out a bid where they can compete competitively with the TNCs and reduce the size of vehicle fleets and reduce the carbon footprint? Food and package delivery and subsidies. Why not get rid of buying vehicles for the government or subsidizing them through nonprofits on Meals on Wheels programs for seniors? Why not have taxis exclusively deliver that? Lobbyists for the taxi industry should be going after that business they got during COVID and convincing the government that it's efficient and they could be part of the solution. And food and package delivery, I think it should be here to stay for the yellows. I think it is here to stay. If you look at Uber Eats and some of these logistics companies, there's a company known as Hailify that I mentioned earlier that cut a deal with some of these companies. And the marketing strategy has to be a rebranding and a reimagination of the cab. We tried to do a little bit of this with the taxi of tomorrow when I was at the TLC when it came to the vehicle. Unfortunately, after I left, the whole thing kind of fell apart for a variety of unrelated reasons. But we need a new vehicle, an app that can get cabs to people safely and quickly. And it needs to be electrified. And we need to go after the government subsidies and the government contracts. And that's the future for the industry. And they need to embrace automation. Unfortunately, what's happening is the taxi industry is looking at getting blood from a stone. They're looking at sending their call centers overseas, consolidating operations. They're cutting the bottom line, but they're not making the service better. There needs to be an influx of investment in the industry. Unfortunately, they're at the point now where they can barely make ends meet and they're going under, so they kind of missed the opportunity. But if hedge funds and private equity entities get interested in this industry, as some have in some cities, it could end up turning the tide and creating some competition for the TNCs. So that's kind of like how I see the taxi world. Taxis are still alive. They're not gone yet. They're on life support, unfortunately. But can they be saved? I think they can with a good plan, some good financing, and with some understanding and open mind from government officials and academics who may look at things after the speech and after reading this chapter a little bit differently than they have in the past. They could be part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. They have a lot of things to offer. Let's see if we can save them.
Well, thank you, Matt. There's certainly quite a bit to discuss there, and I'd like to open it up for any questions that you might have. We can, if you want to make it easier, Maddie, feel free to unshare your screen in the
Okay.
meantime while I open this up too.
Let me
We
figure
can
that
we'll
out.
share the details too. I see Glenn Cook has his hand raised. Glenn, please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Hey, Matt, I got a question for you. Down here in Florida, we are trying to electrify a lot of our fleet. You made reference to electric vehicles and the taxi system up in New York. What are they doing as far as EV readiness type codes for charging infrastructure? That seems to be one of the open dialogues that we all seem to keep hearing is how do you recharge these things, because there's not gas stations on every corner for electric vehicles.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a big problem. I mean, the movement and the progressive politics and the Green New Deal and all these different blue cities and states that are moving in this direction, including New York, all talking about infrastructure, but it's easier said than done. The company I mentioned and probably some others will provide for private infrastructure. I think Gravity is working on that. Revel just launched, I believe they've come to some C in the past on the for-hire side. So they're looking to do that. But Eric Adams, who is the Democratic nominee, we did a report at my university, which goes through all the different mayoral candidates' positions. And he was a big fan of not just reducing the size of the city fleet, but of EVs and infrastructure. There's no specific plans just yet, to do it, but I have high hopes that the incoming mayor will be addressing the infrastructure issue. But like you're involved in this business in Florida to get there. So I think the city, it's going to take a little bit of time to get the city infrastructure built. There's already stuff going on. DOT is working on a variety of projects, but I go back to the days of CNG. When I became general counsel at the TLC, my first assignment was to get rid of the compressed natural gas program, unfortunately. Because you know why? Because the utilities made promises to the TLC many years ago that, we're going to have all these CNG fueling stations, and they ended up only having 10. And, all the taxi fleets got these CNGs on the road, and they were waiting in line with buses and Con Ed vehicles, all lining up at these 10 stations, and they couldn't even get there. So, the TLC was forward thinking in New York. They have authorized the Teslas to go on the road, and hopefully there'll be more competing vehicles. So the TLC did its part. Now it's up to the mayor's office, the private industry, the city planning, and DOT to now create this infrastructure on the streetscape, in private parking garages, allow people to go and do it there. But we don't have it. We're not there. We're like 10 steps ahead. We're pushing the envelope. The movement is beyond aggressive at this point. Everyone wants to do this, but it's going to take time, and it needs to be a serious discussion, and it needs to be planned out well. Rather than the city taking a press release and saying, this company's doing it here, and I want to get credit for it. They should have a plan, a comprehensive plan that looks at all the modes, public and private, even private cars, and what makes sense and where to put the charging infrastructure. So yeah, we're not there yet in New York or anywhere else, but I do believe that many cities will get there, pretty quickly because they're taking it seriously.
Thanks. And I see you, Peter. I just wanted to bring one in from the chat from the DFHV account. Hi, Matt. Do you think taxis should be deregulated? And if so, in what ways?
Is that from Peter?
No,
Not yet.
Not yet.
No, okay, all right. I didn't think you would ask me that question, Peter. Peter and I used to work together for many, many years at TLC. Do I think they need to be deregulated? In a smart way. I think deregulation has two meanings, and people get confused with it. Sometimes when people talk about deregulation, they're talking about supply and demand, capping a number of permits, controlling. I don't think that should be deregulated. I think that would be a disaster. History has already shown that more than once, that if you put an unlimited supply of vehicles on the road, whether it's taxis only or a combination of TNCs, it doesn't work. It just, you need to control the environment for policy reasons. You need to control the economics. When it comes to other forms of deregulation, should that regulators have a rule that requires there be a certain shade of yellow on the cab? Should they be fined if that there's a chip on the cab that hasn't been painted over? I mean, some of the regulations have gone overboard. I mean, I'll admit that. There's like a lot of that stuff can go away. I also think that the economic regulation should be removed. I've always been a fan of having a taxi meter and a taxi fare. My gut is telling me now that maybe we should be doing more experiments with flexible fares or allowing the taxi industry to charge what they want. Uber and Lyft don't have those restrictions on them. It ties the industry's hands. In this environment, unless we're going to start regulating TNC fares the same way, my gut tells me that fare regulation should be looked at. It should be deregulated. When it comes to public safety issues, that should not be touched. Background checks, inspections, those are important things. I think when it comes to deregulation, the little things that don't matter, the fines and the fees for licensing should be reduced. We've done this exercise for regulators in different cities. We even did it a little bit at the New York City TLC, but it fell short. We need to do more of it in this environment, but keep the permits, keep the public safety stuff, get rid of the unnecessary stuff, and maybe tweak or get rid of or loosen the ties on the taxi's ability to compete for fares. And even like putting a screen and I got a client that wanted to put like Wi-Fi in a taxi cab. What we have to go through to get that approved, like you can't touch a cab in New York and other cities, do anything that's innovative without getting TLC to approve it. That should end. That should end. The fleet should be able to pick their own vehicles, okay? They should be able to do these things on their own, because if they can't, and they're subject to the regulator having a 6 to 8 month process, how could they possibly innovate? So I've changed my opinion now that I've been out in the private sector for all these years, and even hanging out in the academic side, I have very different viewpoints post-disruption on these topics.
Thanks, and that was from Wendy Clench. So I appreciate that, Wendy.
I know Wendy.
Peter, yeah. Hi, and Peter, and then John. I see you,
Mr. Mazer. Good to see you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Daus, Professor. I'd like to hear your thoughts on congestion pricing and the roles that the taxi cab industry should have with respect to congestion pricing, whether the cab should be included, excluded, exempted, whatever. And he was facing that in New York City, and I'm probably facing it elsewhere in the country as well. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think they should be exempt from it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I believe London had exempted them originally, and then they got rid of that. But I think from a policy standpoint, if you're looking to have less vehicles in the city, people still need to get around, right, Peter? So if we let them have access to the bus lanes and treat them like buses in some ways, and if they're group riding, let's say, let them come in to the city without a charge and let them ride around without being charged. It's not in the public interest, to have people who can afford the subsidies come in and use the streets. Let them be exempt and let people embrace the exemption so that they can pay less to take a taxi as opposed to bringing their own car in or some other mode. I think they could be part of the solution. So I would support an exemption for that. And I know the industry has been lobbying hard for it. And it's not over yet. I think, Peter, that the governor hasn't formed the panel yet, but I think there's a panel in New York City that will be formed, that will be making decisions or recommendations on the exemptions. Nobody's been appointed to my knowledge, but the new mayor to be, potentially, Eric Adams, has made it really clear he wants to implement this thing immediately. Now that they have the green light from the federal government to some degree. But yeah, sharing should be encouraged for taxis. They should be allowed to use privileged parking and bus lanes, in my opinion, if they're sharing like a bus, and they should be exempt from congestion pricing, in my opinion. I assume you agree.
Maybe you could be appointed to the panel.
I don't know. If there's paperwork involved, I want nothing to do with it.
Hello,
Those days are over.
Okay, John, and then
Yeah,
Jay,
hi.
and then we'll close.
Hey, Matt. Actually, Peter took the question that I was going to ask. I had a two-part question on congestion pricing. So I'm just going to kind of build on what he asked. Wouldn't it be better for the taxi industry if the Uber and Lyft drivers were subject to congestion pricing and taxis were exempt from that?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure that,
Is that under discussion right now?
I mean, I think my understanding is that there's no serious discussion taking place on any of these things. Peter would probably know better than me, what the lobbying efforts are. But I think, one thing is for certain in life, tolls come on and they don't come off. They're banking on this money. The only exception to that was the Staten Island ferry. Rudy Giuliani said Staten Island voted me into office, so as a payback, I'm just going to get rid of the ferry toll. And that was, I think, the only time in recording history, along with Mayor Gaynor, who took the tolls off the East River bridges, that it happened. Other than that, tolls go on, they don't come off. Congestion pricing is, for all practical purposes, a toll. It's a big revenue generator. Mayor de Blasio was sitting gloating, saying if we did this, there'll be a $15 billion check that the city would be getting from MTA. What they would do with that money, you know what? There should be, for the taxi industry, John, a say in what the future of public transit and should look like. In my opinion, there should be a discussion about, if we're not going to exempt taxis and TNCs, how are they going to be part of mobility as a service? Shouldn't they be guaranteed subsidies? Since they're subsidizing their competition, right, through these fares, why shouldn't there be a give back? Why should we be spending money on more buses and rail when we should be spending money on using the taxis and even the TNCs, to their credit, and the Vias of the world, to provide the first and last mile? Peter and I, when we were at TLC, I was a big fan of stands. We should be franchising stands so that when you get out of a subway station, you don't have to wait off peak for a half hour or even Uber someone. There'll be a stand there with an electric charger. Well, there'll be 2 or 3 companies or one company that has the rights to that stand. We did this on the Staten Island side of the Staten Island, bringing up the ferry again. We did this with the Economic Development Corporation. It worked. There was all this unlicensed activity happening with unlicensed cabs causing a threat to people on the Staten Island side of the ferry terminal. People would come over from Manhattan to Staten Island, and we organized and did a bid for a stand to exist with a licensed car service with vetted drivers that would be there ready to pick people up and take them home. These things, this is not rocket science, but public transit has a mindset: buy more trains, buy more buses. Everything has to be fit onto, to get them to do stuff like Via's doing, or sharing rides, or even using the dollar vans, for crying out loud. We have these dollar vans going up and down Flatbush Avenue every day. Why aren't we using them as part of a microtransit solution? MTA needs to be reformed. The governance model is broken. MTA was formed to get rid of Robert Moses. Okay, Rockefeller used it as a bait and switch Trojan horse to get him to support the bill and promised him he'd appoint him, if you read The Power Broker. And then the second it happened, he got rid of Robert Moses. So yeah, he got rid of Robert Moses. A lot of people don't like him anymore, right? But what did it do? It created a system that doesn't work. Singapore's Land Transport Authority is a great example of an agency. They have a plan. They have all modes under one roof. We need to do that in New York City. I've been telling all the mayoral candidates they need to do this. We need a deputy mayor for transportation and infrastructure in every city that's got everything under their control, his or her control. And then we need to physically do what SFMTA did in San Francisco, but get the TNCs under their roof. Get one multimodal agency. The governance system is broken. Until we fix the governance system, nothing will work. We need to get the fleet division of the Department of Citywide Administrative Services out from under that purchasing agency and under a deputy mayor who's going to control the system. I don't think we're going to get the MTA control. Andrew Yang proposed it, and it got shot down pretty quickly. But I do believe that the income New York City Transit should be under the mayor's watch. The buses and the subways, you're paying for it anyway. Let's start there. We got DOT, we got TLC, get the vehicle fleets all over the city. Can't go wrong from there. It's got to get better from there. It can't get any worse, in my opinion. We got to try something. And number two, we need a plan. The West Coast is beating the East Coast. LA, Seattle, Portland, they have plans. We have no plans on the East Coast. Okay, we don't have a plan for transportation and infrastructure. The closest thing we got was Bloomberg's Plan YC, which had a transportation element to it. But we need a transportation plan like Singapore and the UAE has, and many other countries around the world have, where they have these ministries of transport. System's broken. We got to fix the governance. Otherwise, all the great things that some see talks about, it's not going to happen as quickly as we want it to.
Well, thank you. That is a stirring end to our week on policy reform. So I think that's perhaps a perfect place to end it. Thank you, Matt, and the authors of the Routledge Handbook of Public Transport, Windels Marx as a sponsor. Really appreciate that as well. And do look out for IATR announcements if you're on their list as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. Personally, I really appreciate this active book discussion. And I hope that you join us next week for our concluding week on social and political systems. So this is also a nice segue into next week's discussion as well. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the week, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Rudy. Great session. I enjoyed it.